what the Palestinians wanted was really staring us in the face. They told us what they wanted all the time. We just didn't listen, or when we did listen, we didn't take them seriously. What they wanted is what they've always wanted, and they say it to this day, from the river to the sea. They want a single Arab Palestinian state that will be, instead of Israel, rather than, as we assumed, a Palestinian state that would live next to Israel.
Dr. Einat Wilf is the co-author of the book The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. She's a leading Israeli intellectual expert on foreign policy, education, Israeli society, and politics. Einat is a former member of the Israeli parliament on behalf of the Labor and Independence parties. She served as senior advisor to former Prime Minister and President Shimon Peres. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Tal Heinrich, and this is Tal Talks Middle East. With me here, Dr. Einat Wilf. Pleasure to have you on today. How are you?
Very good. Pleasure to be here, Tal.
So Israel is going to the polls again. The fourth time in just 2 years it has become the national sports. Are you considering of running?
No, we seem to just not have enough of democracy and elections, so we just want more and more of it. But in truth, it's exhausting. Sometimes on my days of half cup full, I decide to view it as at least the better version of a difficult crisis. So at least the way we work through our domestic crises is through multiple elections. And I'm thinking, okay, if that's the way we go, let it be.
I love the spirit. I love how you view this. So I just introduced you as a former member of the Israeli parliament, the Israeli Knesset, where you served between 2010 and 2013 as a representative of the Israeli center left, or left, we can say. But I assume that if someone was to read your book, The War of Return, people who not necessarily know you, their first guess wouldn't be to cast you on the left side of the political map in Israel. Am I right?
That is, for some people, there's no doubt that one of the most valuable things about the book is that both Adi Schwartz, the co-writer, and myself come from the Israeli left. Adi was a senior editor in Haaretz, a liberal newspaper. I was a member of the Labor Party, very much of the Israeli left. And this is precisely the reason we wrote the book. And our journey and our reason for writing the book is in some ways representative of the entire Israeli left. People who very much believed that peace was possible. And not only that peace was possible, but that the path to peace with the Palestinians and the entire Arab world as a result was actually quite simple. It was based on a formula of land for peace. And all that Israel has to do to make peace is hand over land, whether it's the Golan Heights or the Sinai Peninsula, as it did with Egypt, and of course the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. If Israel will hand over the land that it captured as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel should expect peace. And for many Israelis who were defined by the idea of seeking peace through this idea of the exchange of land for peace, the Palestinian failure to accept such a deal, the fact that Palestinian leaders, whether it's Arafat in 2000 or Abu Mazen in 2008, and there were other instances, but those are the most prominent, walked away from opportunities to have the land to establish an independent Palestinian state, free of occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including the Old City. The fact that they walked away from two such opportunities and followed these rejections by violence, and that they were not criticized by their own people, which meant that they reflected what the Palestinians wanted, led much of the Israeli left to conclude that what we thought the Palestinians wanted, which was the land, an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, is not what actually the Palestinians wanted, that they wanted something else. And the book is very much about what they really want rather than what we thought they wanted.
So how did it start? Your book, you describe it as a journey of yours and Adi Schwartz, who is an internationally acclaimed Israeli journalist. You just needed to figure out how and why.
So both of us, like many in the Israeli left, faced a very simple question. Once we saw the Palestinians have repeatedly rejected opportunities for state in the West Bank and Gaza, we asked ourselves, then what do they want?
Mm-hmm.
They really do not want an end to the occupation because they could have had it by having an independent state. They clearly do not want an end to the settlements because they could have had a state free of settlements. They clearly don't want a state with a capital in East Jerusalem because that was on the table and they walked away from that. So we asked a simple question, and the entire Israeli left asked a simple question. What do they want? And what we realized is that what the Palestinians wanted was really staring us in the face. They told us what they wanted all the time. We just didn't listen, or when we did listen, we didn't take them seriously. What they wanted is what they've always wanted, and they say it to this day, from the river to the sea. They want a single Arab Palestinian state that will be, instead of Israel, rather than, as we assumed, a Palestinian state that would live next to Israel. And what we realized is that in the present, this hope, this dream of the Palestinians for a Palestine, an Arab Palestine from the river to the sea, is manifested in this thing that they call the right of return, which, as we show in the book, is neither a right nor a return, but it is, from the Palestinians' perspective, their belief, their claim that millions of Palestinians, the numbers run between 5 to 9 million, who are descendants of the original several hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who fled or were expelled during the 1948 war, that their millions of descendants possess a right. They believe they have a legal right that supersedes Israeli sovereignty to settle inside Israel. And the numbers, of course, are such that the exercise of this so-called right would render Israel an Arab state with a Jewish minority. So throughout the negotiation years, when Palestinians claimed to support a two-state solution, some of them still claim to do so, but they continued to insist. In the book we show, they never parted from that. They continued to insist that they possess this right of return, which is non-negotiable. It's not one of the things to negotiate over. Then what they were really saying all along, and we just failed to listen, was that a two-state solution meant an Arab-Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab-Palestinian state to replace Israel. There has not been to date any Palestinian leader, or for that matter, an op-ed writer, whose vision of peace was an Arab-Palestinian state next to a sovereign state for the Jewish people. And this is what we discuss in the book.
So I see your book as a Google Translate tool for the Palestinian perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't know if you heard this definition before, but I like it. Just to make things clear, you talk about the Palestinian leaders, but when you conducted the research, the journey behind your book, you talked to Palestinians from all walks of life, right?
Yes, one of the things we're most proud about in the book is that really it gives voice to the Palestinians themselves. You spoke about the Palestinian perspective, a translator, a Google translator, hopefully a better one, a more accurate one, Google Translate. But one of the very first reviews of the book was by a Palestinian scholar. And of course, the amazing thing is that I can summarize his review in one word, which is duh. Basically, his review was, what took you so long? Of course, this is what we want. We've been saying it all along. So I have not yet had any Palestinian to comment who said, no, we don't really care about this. This is a marginal issue for us. Of course, it's negotiable. I mean, they do argue. They say they do have this right. Of course, they should. They should exercise it. But none of them argue with the central thesis that this is the most important thing for the Palestinians. far more important than having a state in part of the land, which really explains their behavior. It's very simple. It's amazing. Once you understand this, once you understand their actual priorities, their behavior over the decades emerges as very consistent. Every time that they were told, look, you can have some of the land, you can have your state of your own, independence, liberty, but it will be in some of the land. And next to you, there will be another state for the Jewish people. Every time they basically said no, typically violently, and said, look, we don't think the Jews have any business being here at all, certainly not in an independent state of their own. This is why, from the Palestinian perspective, the entire conflict is not a conflict between two nations fighting over land and having to find the proper border between them. It's about one group, in their view, the Jews, the Zionists, who are foreigners, who don't belong in the land, who, in their analogy, are like the French in Algeria, the British, the Crusaders, which means that, by definition, our presence in the land is temporary. With enough resistance and violence, we are going to leave.
But you know what's remarkable? I assume if you talk to almost every Israeli on the street right now, and you'd ask them, what do you think about the so-called Palestinian right of return? Israelis will just dismiss this argument, this Palestinian demand, right away. It's not even worth talking about. It's not rational. It's not a rational demand. Never going to happen. Skip. Let's move forward. So how come that this vision is very much alive among Palestinians?
So the amazing thing about this so-called right of return is that it enjoys the broadest consensus in both societies. It is the broadest consensus among Palestinians in support of it. You will not find Palestinian voices who speak against it. And it is, of course, the broadest consensus in Israeli society in rejection of it, which is why it's such a major obstacle. And it's not something that you can negotiate and find an agreement. Because as far as the Palestinians are concerned, it's not a matter of numbers, it's a matter of rights, it's a matter of their very identity. Now, the reasons that the Palestinians, unlike any other refugee population throughout the 20th century, are still sitting more than 70 years after the war from which they became refugees, 1948, the fact that they still claim to be refugees from that war, unlike any other refugee population and their millions of descendants, is that they were allowed to indulge in that worldview, unlike all the other refugee populations. I mean, the Palestinians are far from unique in having been displaced by war. And let me remind, even though Palestinians like to present themselves as innocent bystanders, they were an active part to the war. They waged a war to prevent the partition of the land and to prevent the establishment of the state of Israel in any borders. And they lost that war in the sense that Israel managed to emerge from it as a state. And as in any war throughout the 20th century, where empires receded, the Ottoman, the British, and new states were established and borders were created, there were refugee populations, Korea, India, Pakistan, all across Europe, Africa, of course, hundreds of millions of refugees across Europe, across the globe. They're not refugees today. Why? Because they were not indulged. The message of the world to refugee populations throughout the 20th century was, it's tragic, it's sad, move on. You do not look back.
And in your book, you mentioned UNRWA in that sense, the dedicated UN agency for Palestinian refugees. You say in your book that UNRWA is part of the problem and not part of the solution. Can you explain?
Clearly, when there were refugees after 1948, a temporary agency, and UNRWA is still amazingly after 70 years a temporary agency, was established to help the refugees integrate economically into the places where they fled, which, by the way, was the West Bank, Gaza, under Jordanian and Egyptian control, respectively, Jordan, and a bit in Syria and Lebanon. And it was very natural to think, especially given the experience all over the world, in Europe and Asia and Africa, that they would be integrated into the local population. They were no different from the Jordanians, from the Syrians, from the Lebanese. They were not called Palestinians at the time. That only came later. But they themselves, not just their host countries, they themselves refused integration because they knew that that meant that the war would be over. And the most amazing thing about the War of 1948 is that you see that the Palestinians refused to accept it as a done deal. As far as they're concerned, Israel might have won the battle, but it did not win the war. Israel is destined to disappear, and they will wait Israel out. And UNRWA, which was supposed to close after a few years, just as a similar agency in Korea did, after integrating the refugees to the local population, would not close because the Arabs basically threatened the Western funders of UNRWA that they must keep UNRWA open and functioning so as to keep the file of 1948 open. And that's why 70 years after, we have millions of people who for generations, for decades, have been indulged both by the Arab world and the West in a view that says you do not have to move on. Unlike other refugee populations, you can still keep the war of 1948 alive. You can still continue to imagine yourself as if you can one day win this war, which means to undo Israel, by this mechanism of return. You will one day make Israel disappear. So the Palestinians have been kept by their desire, but the world indulged them in this. And in this 70-year limbo of keeping a war that they were not pleased with its outcome, keeping the war open so that one day they can close the war in a way that they want and not in the way that actually happened.
And of course, there is, the status of a refugee definition by UNRWA and the status of a refugee definition by every other UN agency that deals with refugees. According to the UNRWA definition, I am to be considered a refugee from Morocco, and you are a refugee from where exactly?
Oh, many places. But yes, in one of my favorite paragraphs in the book, we create this dystopian image that we say that if refugees throughout the 20th century would have been treated like the Arab refugees from the War of 1948, we would have had hundreds of millions, if not over 1 billion people, still considering themselves refugees, refusing to build a future, sitting on the borders of other countries, seething with views of revenge, committed to ongoing war. Europe would have never seen peace after World War II, not Asia, not Africa. This, what happened in the Middle East, would have been the dystopia of the rest of the world if what was indulged with the Palestinians would have been done with other refugee populations. And you're absolutely right. All other refugee populations were treated by the proper UN Refugee Agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which means the vast majority of them did not go back to their former homes. They moved on, as tragic and sad as it was, and built new lives. You mentioned Morocco. Jews were expelled for no reason except for stupid revenge that other Jews won a war. They were expelled from across North Africa, the Middle East. They built new lives. People went through tremendous tragedies throughout the 20th centuries. They moved on. They built new lives. They do not sit on the borders seething with plans of revenge for 70 years.
When I'm thinking about it, you use the word indulgence. It also appears in the headline of your book. I assume that if a Palestinian was to be on this conversation right now, I 100% understand your definition of indulgence. But I don't think they would accept that. They will tell you, well, in places like Libya, Iraq, even in Jordan, Jordan is some sort of a different, definition, but in Lebanon, in Egypt, in all these places, we're not indulged, they would tell you. We are being deprived of, certain political rights, certain human rights, some would say. So how could this be an indulgence?
So first, just to be clear a bit about the situation and the numbers. Out of about 5.5 million so-called refugees who are registered by UNRWA today, almost all of them descendants, 80% live in Gaza, the West Bank, or are citizens of Jordan. So by no criteria they are refugees. If you're a 30-year-old lawyer who lives in Ramallah, was born in Ramallah, never displaced by war, you are not a refugee. That's 40% of those registered as refugees live in the West Bank and Gaza. Where they are is where they will be, is where they need to build their future. They're not refugees. Another 40% are citizens of Jordan. They're not refugees either. So to continue to register them as refugees is to indulge a vision that has no connection to reality. You are absolutely right that in Syria and Lebanon, they were denied in varying degrees. Lebanon was the worst. Their rights as Arab-born Syrians and Lebanese. They're not considered Syrians and Lebanese. They're deprived of political rights and many social and economic rights. And indeed, the reason is precisely because they're not treated like proper refugees. They're treated like these Palestinian refugees who are expected one day to live in a Palestine that would replace Israel. That's the only solution that is acceptable to them. If you tell them, and there were efforts over the decades, go take a German passport, and you will no longer be considered a refugee from Palestine. Well, what they do is they take the German passport, but they insist on continuing to be registered by UNRWA in Syria or Lebanon as refugees from Palestine. So it's a political worldview which is being indulged here. Of course, individual people are often suffering, but it is a suffering that collectively they want or they have chosen in the name of the greater battle, which they believe is just and noble and worthy of sacrifice, of throwing out the foreigners who in their mind have stolen their land.
So in 2018, President Trump did something that I assume nobody in the West would have ever thought that a US administration will ever do. He cut the US funding to UNRWA. We heard several times, I believe, Ambassador Nikki Haley, you and Ambassador Nikki Haley, raising these questions that you raise now. Who is really a Palestinian refugee? Why are they still being defined as refugees by these countries, by the UN agency? How come nobody in the West, except for Israel and the Trump administration, asked these questions before?
So this is one of the things that Dee and I struggled with in our book. And in many ways, the answer has been just inertia. We show in the book, in the history, that in the 1950s, the West actually did want to close down UNRWA. It realized that UNRWA was useless, that it was not settling a single refugee, that unlike the Korean agency, nothing good is coming out of UNRWA, and they wanted to close it down. But as I mentioned, they were threatened by the Arab world. And at the time, it was Eisenhower and, oil and the Cold War. There were a lot of considerations. And the way that the U.S. Viewed it is that it was peanuts to give money to UNRWA to keep the Arab world semi-placated. And from that moment on, it begins to be a bit of a constant bribe or a form of protection. Just like the store owner pays the mob, and they don't think about it anymore. They just pay the protection money every month or every year. So this is what the West paid. It was basically protection money to the Arab world. No one thought about it anymore. No one even kind of raised questions. And if anyone raised questions, they were immediately shot down. I guess you needed to have someone. I would always joke that President Trump doesn't like anything that has caps lock acronyms. He sees UNRWA, he sees NATO, he sees, let's get out. So I guess you had someone who was willing to break with Beltway orthodoxies. And I think also, given his background, he had the intuition that he no longer needs to pay the mob, that the time for paying protection was over, that the Arab world is no longer going to ask him. There will be no consequences in the Arab world for defunding UNRWA. and he was absolutely right in his intuition. There were zero consequences in the Arab world for defunding UNRWA. The unfortunate thing is that because of the amazing partisanship in the US, it's become impossible to discuss specific policies of President Trump and the merits of those specific policies. It's as if, okay, whatever he did is wrong, and no one's willing to have a serious, rational discussion as to whether this specific policy happened to be the right one. So I know there are a lot of people itching to bring the money back in the new administration. I hope that's not going to happen, but it will be a terrible thing to do, because if we go to the beginning of our conversation, despite everything, I'm still very much a lefty. I am a peacemaker. I am very much a person who wants to, ultimately, I believe that there are two peoples on the land, and we are best served by living in two different polity states and dividing the land between us. But I now understand that it's not as simple as just drawing a border. I now understand that Palestinians have to basically go through a reformatting of an undoing of 70 years in which they were told that they will return, that they were refugees. They need to go through the process that every other refugee population went through, which is to come to terms with the fact that the war is over and they need to move on and build their future wherever they are. And this process cannot start as long as UNRWA remains, as long as it is funded by the West, as long as it is viewed to have the support of America. Anyone who supports the funding of UNRWA is supporting the continuation of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. It's just as simple as that.
That's a very powerful sentence, Einat. I 100% agree with it. The good thing, well, some will say, is that the Middle East is changing. This is what President Trump has read into the region. That's why he brought us the Abraham Accords, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the UAE, and Bahrain. Petrodollars, I mean, it's not an issue as it was, let's say, 20 years ago. The United States right now is energy independent. So all of this is also concentrating around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and somewhat, shaping the new discourse around it for good or bad, depends who you're asking. I want to ask you, when you talk to Palestinians nowadays, what do they tell you about these recent agreements between Israel and certain Arab countries, normalization of ties agreements, peace agreements? Because when I talk to people in Bahrain or the United Arab Emirates, for example, they usually tell me, they're not even shy about it, that they are very much disappointed, and I'm saying it in the softest words possible, from the Palestinian leadership.
So absolutely, first, you're right. The whole situation in the region is changing. It's the reason I'm actually optimistic for peace, not just broadly in the region, but also with Palestinians. Because the one thing that enabled Palestinians to continue in their rejectionist policy, to keep saying no, 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 no to any program that divided the land between an Arab state and a Jewish state, was because they knew for decades that they had the backing of the Arab world, and for a time the Soviet Union, and of course the indulgence of the West. All of that came together to give the Palestinians the backing to say, keep your rejectionist ways. When the Arab world is beginning to pull away from that and peel away that blank check support for Palestinian rejectionism, over time, that will force a reckoning within the Palestinians in terms of what their goals are, and are they really interested in continuing to suffer, to sacrifice for generations in the hope of a Palestine from the river to the sea. But at the moment, Palestinians, first of all, they view these accords clearly as betrayal. This is the overwhelming sentiment. They hope that it will stop. So there's this kind of vision that says, okay, if it stops now, we can contain it. We're not happy about it, but we can contain it. But there is an understanding, and I'm hearing it from Palestinian scholars and pollsters, that if this will continue, if more Arab countries, Saudi is clearly a big one, if more Arab countries will move forward with normalizing relations with Israel, and especially with the kind of warm, open, welcoming normalization that is even openly supporting of the Zionism, of the Jewish state, of the idea of Jews as indigenous, as belonging to the region rather than as foreigners, if there's going to be more of those accords, it's clear to the Palestinians that they will have to change track. One way is to find other sponsors for rejectionism, Turkey, Iran, and that might be an interim stage, but hopefully there will come the moment that happened for every people in the world, and that the Palestinians are not unique, that they had to come to terms with their true power, with the limitations, if they no longer have the support of the Arab world, if hopefully they no longer have the indulgence of the West, they can then say, okay, what can we achieve knowing our true power, our true size? And I think then we can finally move to the peace that eluded us of two states for two peoples.
And the Trump administration clearly, with the deal of the century, this concept has tried to push in that direction by getting more Arab countries in the region involved in the process. We all remember the economic workshop in Bahrain. But I want to focus for a second on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because he has long envisioned this process of peace through strength. And there's no way to turn it around. The peace agreements with Morocco, Sudan, the UAE, Bahrain, it's all part of this vision, whereas other world leaders and Israeli leaders, they did not foresee that coming. Even, the Obama administration, they kept saying there are no shortcuts, meaning first you have to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and only then you can address the Arab-Israeli conflict. But Netanyahu and the Trump administration, they saw that that it's not a shortcut going the other way, that it's simply part of a natural process, and that we are now in a place where we should be. My question is, with Joe Biden administration, we see names like Anthony Blinken, John Kerry being part of the administration. It's about to enter the White House now. We have establishment figures there who were proponents of the old paradigm. And where do you see things going? And why would the Middle East, players in the Middle East, listen to these establishment people who were very much wrong in the past?
Well, I think they're not. I think certainly the Arab world is not only is it not going to listen to them, it's going to be telling them that things have changed. And if there's one continuing element which continued from the Obama presidency to the Trump presidency, is that America is leaving the Middle East. I said that, Israel doesn't have the benefit of being able to pivot to Asia. We're kind of stuck here, right? This is where our history, our forefathers chose this place. So this is it. This is where the Jews belong. So we're not pivoting to Asia. We're staying here. And that means that our future is in peace with the Arab world. And the Arab world has also come to appreciate that Israel, it really belongs here. And I think it's not just because we were telling our story so beautifully, showing them that Zionism is really about the liberation of an indigenous people and their homeland. It does have to do with strength and perseverance. Over time, they realized that these Jews do not behave like the British, do not behave like the French, and do not behave like the Crusaders. We're not leaving, which I think over time led them to understand that we are attached to this place in a way that is not characteristic of colonialists, which is how they perceived us in the beginning, and are beginning to come to terms with the fact that we are indeed the Jews of this land, not some foreign implant. And I think, especially given all the changes in the Arab Spring, what's happening in Iran, the fact that America is leaving the Middle East, the Arab world is looking to Israel as a reliable ally. And I think they're going to be telling the new administration that they're going to continue to move forward with Israel, and they have interests with Israel. I had one Palestinian scholar, really interesting. He defined this as the Brexit moment for the Arab world, where the Arab world is looking to have bilateral relations with Israel and no longer to work in unison. And you saw when the Palestinians went to the Arab League, which used to be a sure card for them, and told them, look what the UAE is doing, sanctioned them, as they did Egypt in the 70s. The UAE basically said, nope. The Arab League said the UAE can do whatever it wants. It's a sovereign country, and it can have a bilateral agreement with Israel. That's a huge change in the Arab world.
It is a huge change. The world is realizing that there is no longer a united approach against Israel within Arab states, as you mentioned about the Arab League. And what's even more remarkable, I think, is a development that we're seeing in recent weeks, that even countries like Qatar and Turkey are suddenly facing this choice. Do you want to be on the side of regional progress, or do you want to be on the side of troublemakers? I mean, time will tell. But let's circle back to the conclusions in your book, because what you do, you and Adi Schwartz again, are doing, is to take the Palestinian demands and their perception of the conflict at their face value. How important is it when you come to discuss a potential solution? I assume that you're probably being asked, all right, so Einat, I read your book, but what are you suggesting? Where's the solution?
So the solution is in the last chapter of the book. We're basically saying there is no use entering any kind of negotiations before the war is over. It's almost banal. In the book, we say the phrase, if there is to be peace, the war must end. People somehow forget that they always made peace after they ended war, not during the war. The war must end. As long as the Palestinians are under the impression, and they are under the impression, that the war of 1948 is still an ongoing open file, we cannot make peace. We cannot negotiate peace when the 1948 war in their mind is still ongoing and still can be won for their side. They're not going to compromise with us if they still think that a generation or two from now, we are destined to be on the losing side of the history and the losing side of this war. So first, the war must be over. And the Palestinians need to come to terms with the fact that the war of 1948 is over, and, to be blunt, that they lost in the fundamental sense that a state for the Jewish people was established and will remain. They failed in the goal of that war to prevent the establishment of the state of Israel. Now they can move on. But first, the file on the war of 1948 must be closed, which means the war is over. They are not refugees. There is no such thing as a right of return into the state of Israel. We explain in the book why there is no such right, and there never was. So all of these things, it should be clear, not only that they're not elements to negotiate, that they simply do not exist. Palestinians are not refugees, and there's no right of return into the state of Israel, and the war of 1948 is over. To achieve this blunt messaging, UNRWA must be dismantled, and in the book we have very detailed proposals on how to dismantle UNRWA while transferring its services to the local providers. Once this blunt messaging gets through, we can then get to the deal-making element of peace, where to draw the borders, how to have a capital in Jerusalem for both states, which I support, what to do with settlements, the border, security arrangements, economic arrangements. Those are the details of peace that can be negotiated only after it's clear that the war is over. And that's the part that needs to be taken care of first.
Once these conditions are met. It's a very interesting approach, and it's crazy that it's considered a new approach. It's what should have been there in the first place, this realization that you're describing. Your book concentrates, in our conversation here, around the Palestinian perception, about the Palestinian public consensus. I want, before we wrap up the conversation, to touch a bit about the Israeli public consensus. And I assume there's no doubt that over the past decade, the Israeli society politically has shifted rightwards. We see it in the polls. We will see it probably next time when Israel goes to the polls, because if what I'm reading from here, being here in the United States, is correct, you see in Israel even people from the left or center left right now standing behind right-wing frontrunners in the election with the aim of unsitting Prime Minister Netanyahu. How do you see this shift rightwards, and are you part of this in your perception of the conflict? Have you moved rightwards, Einat?
I actually think that I represent, sometimes I joke that I don't know if I represent 70% of people in Israel or the 5 people that I know and who have become my friends. I think I represent both sides. The Israeli public, certainly since the breakdown of the various peace negotiations, the violence that followed them, the understanding that Palestinians want everything, the Israeli public has basically rationally concluded that there's no use negotiating with Palestinians over the partition of the land because the war is still ongoing and the war must first be over. So I don't know if every Israeli will define it in those terms, but every Israeli viscerally understands that at this moment there's no use negotiating because what the Palestinians want is our suicide, and that is not what we're willing to do, our national suicide. Now, so in that sense, Israelis have moved to the right in terms of having a very dim view of the prospects of a negotiated settlement for Palestinians. But the Israeli public has also moved very much to the left in the sense that you saw when Netanyahu gave up this annexation for normalization with Dubai, except for 3 settlers, who cared? I mean, people were happy to forgo annexation for normalization with Dubai. It's a great deal. So this shows you that Israel ultimately were cognizant of our status as a Jewish minority in an Arab and Islamic region, which means that if the price of making peace with the Arab and Islamic world, and as I said, we're not pivoting to Asia, this is where our future is. We need to make peace with the Arab and Islamic world. If the price of that peace will be dividing the land, will be an independent Palestinian polity in the West Bank and Gaza, you will find that 70-80% of the Israeli public supports that because ultimately we understand our status and we want that peace. So I think, oddly, the Israeli public has both flung to the left, to the right in terms of its dim view of the prospects for negotiations with Palestinians right now, but very much also to the left in terms of understanding that if the price of peace is the partition of the land, so be it.
And probably one of the biggest differences is that Israel is speaking in one voice, whether people are on the right or the left, it doesn't really matter because the leaders speak to all. Whereas on the Palestinian side, you're not sure who is speaking for who. You have Gaza, you have Mahmoud Abbas, you have the people on the street, you have, the UN agency speaking for them as well.
They actually all speak with one voice. I mean, the whole notion that they're extremists and moderates, they're only extremists and moderates in terms of the tactics, the means, but they are incredibly united in their goal that there should not be a Jewish state. How best to achieve this goal, they have different views. That's the difference between the moderates and the extremists. But there's no one that has a vision of peace where there's a Jewish state next to an Arab state. And you're right that on the Israeli side, we're also generally united in the fact that we want a Jewish state. We want a sovereign state for the Jewish people. We maybe have very deep disagreements about what kind of state that should be, but that's the state we want. And as long as this is the conflict, it cannot be, there's no way to split it. If one side says, there cannot be a state for the Jewish people, and the other side, says we want a state for the Jewish people, well, there's your conflict. This is not something that could be resolved. It's not a difference and you can split in the middle. So either the Palestinians change their goal, which is not to say that there cannot be any Jewish state, that they're willing to live next to a Jewish state, or as they hope, and they're working towards that the Jews will give up their goal of having a Jewish state and will agree to be a Jewish minority in an Arab state, or as sometimes they say, go back to where we came from, which is what we did. We came back to where we came from, which is here, the land of Israel.
Let me ask you the question to wrap things up that I asked you in the beginning of our conversation. Do you miss politics? Do you ever see yourself going back to Israeli politics or, some peace negotiator position maybe?
I am deeply ambivalent about Israeli politics, as I think many people are. I sometimes compare it to an ancient Greek curse. Basically, when you enter politics, you're being told by the Greek gods, you will now get a megaphone, so your voice will be louder and people will hear you more than others. But the curse is that nothing that comes out of this megaphone will bear any resemblance to anything you said. So now you need to decide if you want this megaphone. And I'm a person of words. I'm a person of ideas. I write books. I give talks. So I'm ambivalent about having a megaphone where nothing that comes out of it bears any resemblance to what I actually say. So for now, I'll stick to books and lectures.
Well, we hope that we here were able to give you a very accurate megaphone as part of this conversation. Dr. Einat Wilf, it's been a pleasure. Amazing, incredible, important insights. Anyone who knows, anyone who wants to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should definitely take a look at your book, or at least listen to this conversation once again.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you all for watching. That's all for today. I'm Tal Heinrich, and this is Tal Talks Middle East.